Sean Bell is a retired Royal Air Force pilot and Sky News military analyst. Welcome to our program, Sean.
Daniel, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to Ukraine.
Ukrainian drones have knocked out nearly 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity. This is a new high record in modern history of Russia, according to recent estimates reported by the Moscow Times. Don't you think that this is too much even for Russia's so-called wartime economy and Russian dictator Putin?
I think if you are going to win a war, like the war that you're involved with today, it's very, very difficult to do that only on the battlefield. I think one of the things that Ukraine has done very well is recognize that Russia has to finance the war, and it has great oil and gas reserves. But by striking those, it's stopping Russia earning the revenues required in order to fund the war. What I'm not sure about is there are different numbers being talked about. 40% is a lot of the oil and gas. And sometimes if you watch the videos of when Ukraine has successfully struck the site, not all of the site has exploded. A small part sometimes has. And it's very difficult sometimes that I think the statistics look at the whole site rather than individual. But if you look at this from a grand macroeconomic perspective, there's no doubt Russia is feeling the pain of these strikes. And there's lots of evidence that even Muscovites are limited about the amount of petrol and gas they can buy now. They need to have a voucher for it. The pain is being felt by Russia.
Do you feel that this is sustainable for Vladimir Putin's grip on power? Because as you just mentioned, people in Russia really feel this results of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And second question would be, don't you think that this is Ukraine's one of the biggest achievements in this deep battle against Russia? Putin can't handle it, he can stop it, and Ukraine continues to strike deep inside Russia on Russia's oil refining capacity.
I do agree that it's been a great success for Ukraine. The question I have as a military person is that where is the vital ground in this battle? The vital ground is on the front lines, and Ukraine is doing an exceptionally good job of slowing down the Russian attack. But Russia is still moving forward. Now, Russia might have expected at the start of this year that they were going to make great inroads into Ukraine. Ukraine has been very effective at slowing Russia down. They haven't taken as much territory, and Russia has paid a dreadful price for the advances they've made. But this war, I think, will continue until President Putin has achieved his objectives on the battlefield. And some of the estimates suggest that may be years, not months, before he achieves that. So your question is whether the Russian economy will still support the war. I think ever since you and I started talking about the war, there's been suggestions the Russian economy is on the brink of collapse. It hasn't been. It is still selling its oil and gas around the world. But I do think this has been a very successful episode for Ukraine in these attacks.
You just mentioned about Vladimir Putin. Let's cover his current strategy and behavior. Don't you think that he feels humiliated by these new attacks on Russia's energy grip on oil refining capacity?
Well, when you and I have had talks before, I do understand why Ukraine is looking for the bright things, the potential ways that Ukraine is making progress. But if you look at this again, grand strategically, if I was a military advisor to President Putin at the moment, I think I would look that he'd think it was going very well. Part of his biggest risk, Putin's biggest risk, was that the West gets involved and supports Ukraine directly. If you look back a year, NATO was fairly united. If you look today, America looks less comfortable as part of NATO, and European countries are trying to balance helping Ukraine, but also looking after their own security. A good example is Poland, spending a lot more money on defense, but the main focus of that is on national defense. I think Vladimir Putin would feel, rather than being isolated by the international community, Russia is closer to China, closer to Iran, closer to North Korea, closer to India. It has created a new alternative axis of evil, if you like. And I don't think Putin will be feeling humiliated at all at the moment. He will be hurting. And I think if that pain can continue to increase, you never know when he will want to stop. But I don't think he's close to wanting to stop just yet.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin recently ordered conscription of 135,000 men, and this is the largest conscription drive in 9 years. What does this mean for Putin's war machine, and what could this indicate?
Yes, I mean, it does indicate Russia is hurting for manpower. You will remember over the course of the war, Russia used the Wagner Group, which are mercenaries, to fight. It also went into its prisons and used a load of prisoners. It also used North Korean troops to fight, and some reports that Chinese troops. But as you know, Russia is a very big country. It's 4 times the size of population of Ukraine. And although Putin will be protecting the Muscovites, those people who live in Moscow, people who live elsewhere in Russia, they don't necessarily have good communications. They don't know the huge scale of these numbers that you are using now. And I think so far President Putin has got away with continuing to do conscription. His very positive message to Russians is this is a righteous war that Russia is being forced to fight. There's not much evidence at the moment that the Russian population is starting to turn, because that will be a very dangerous sign for Vladimir Putin.
I would like also to hear your take on recent statements by Richard Moore, head of the British MI6 intelligence agency. Quote, Putin lies. He lies to the world, he lies to his people, he even lies to himself. But we should not believe him or credit him with strengths he does not have. What is your reaction to this interesting take?
I think he's absolutely right. I think what's very scary is Putin has a very tight control of communication in Russia. He tells the Russian people what he wants them to believe. And there are many Russians that I have worked with in the West who find it very difficult now, because they are falling out with their families back in Russia, because their Russian families believe a completely different story than we are seeing in the West. And I think that control is a very, very difficult mechanism. But I think also, if you remember the Alaska summit, a lot of the news saw that as a great opportunity. But as a military guy, I watched President Putin being welcomed with applause by President Trump, red carpet. And I think we are very confused at the moment about what America's position is, because that didn't feel like the way you would welcome a leader that has invaded a European country, has been responsible for such a dreadful war, devastated communities, killing up to 1 million people. So I think the West is a bit confused about its narrative as well at the moment.
You just mentioned about this Alaska summit. Putin has been emboldened by this summit, but recently US President Donald Trump said that Ukraine could retake all territories taken by the Russian side. What is your view on this possible U-turn of US President Trump?
There's been a lot of speculation about this. My thoughts, again, as a military person, one president saying something differently doesn't change the situation on the battlefield at all. What does it mean that actually America will completely change its approach? We will have to wait and see. I was much more struck by that announcement by President Trump, that President Trump made that announcement not in the news, but on his own social media network. He has a big stake in that. It's worth a lot of money to him. Every time he puts out a sensational statement, it has people flocking to his social media channel and therefore makes him a lot of money. I'm not entirely sure. We've seen a lot of statements from the United States president. I have to admit, I don't understand fully why he keeps switching tack. But at the moment, I don't think those words mean anything in terms of the battlefield. We'll have to wait and see.
Also, US Vice President J.D. Vance says that his administration is considering possibility of providing Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. According to the Wall Street Journal, this request was handed over to President Trump during his meeting with President Zelensky in the United Nations. What is your opinion on that? Is it achievable task for Ukraine to use these missiles against Russia? Do you see this as a military plan or just bargaining chip for negotiations with Putin? And third question would be, what is your take of the possible effects of this missile could also take on the Russian side, on Russian economy?
There's a lot of questions in there. What I will try to do is break it up. I think we talked about the strategy of Ukraine of attacking Russia's energy infrastructure. Anything that can be done to put pressure on that, I think, is a good thing. Tomahawk cruise missiles are very capable, very accurate. They're stealthy, they're fast, not easy to shoot down. But there also are not that many of them, and it's very unclear at the moment as to how many restrictions that America would put on their use. So I'm not sure it would make a huge difference. What I do think has made a difference is that the United Kingdom provided Ukraine with Storm Shadow missiles that were very effective at doing some strikes against the Russian Navy infrastructure and lots of other key targets. But the key has been that Ukraine has been developing its own long-range strike capability. The Flamingo missile, very capable long-range missile being produced in numbers. President Zelensky is saying he was going to produce 1 million drones, and some of those are long-range. What the West is doing is providing the pieces of those. Here's a seeker head, here's the explosive, here's the guidance section. Bolt them all together. You don't need to do the testing that the West has to do, all the safety checks. You can just put them together, fire it, and off it goes. You get that capability much quicker. And I think that's proving itself on the battlefield. It's no coincidence that you are much more effective now at striking some of these Russian targets in the deep. Russia hasn't got the defenses in place, so you're already developing that deep strike capability. Would Tomahawk be welcome? Of course it would. But do I think it would change the game? I don't know.
You just mentioned about Flamingo, Ukraine-made cruise missile. According to the recent information, this missile is twice as powerful as Tomahawk cruise missile. What is your take on the technical details of this new weapon made by Ukraine?
Yes, I hope you have a picture of it, because it does look a very big missile. It looks very powerful. The statistics look very good, long range, fast. The trouble is that technology means that isn't the only things you want from a missile. The bigger it is, the easier it is to shoot down. So you need to have stealth capability into a missile. The Flamingo does not look very stealthy. I may be wrong, but having worked on stealth programs before, I think there will be a big radar cross-section to that missile, so people will know it's coming a long way away. It's also, you need reliable missiles. One of the things about Western technology is that it's tested very, very carefully so that most of the missiles launch, track, and strike their target. The key here will be whether or not this missile has that capability, that maturity, and that accuracy, because that is what Ukraine needs. It's no good firing a missile and it gets shot down. It's no good firing a missile and it misses its target. So the key will be whether these Flamingo missiles start to hit and really hurt Putin. I hope they do, because this is a great initiative for Ukraine.
You just mentioned about hurting Vladimir Putin. President Zelensky warned Kremlin that if Russia doesn't agree to end this war against Ukraine, then Russian officials should go and find the closest shelters to hide and try to protect themselves against Ukrainian missiles and drones. Do you see this as a message to Vladimir Putin and his inner circle about the possibility of direct strikes on Russia's governmental buildings?
I think there is a lot of rhetoric, a lot of words around war. Russia has been very quick to rattle the nuclear saber regularly, and there is no prospect. I lived through the Cold War. I was in the military. My first time in the military was in the Cold War. We were living with the constant threat of nuclear weapons. but there was no benefit to any country for using them. So Vladimir Putin is simply using that as a threat against the West, and the West is trying to match with the threat against Vladimir Putin. As a result, I think we've got to be very careful. The rhetoric is one thing, it's quite another what we're seeing on the battlefield. And bluntly at the moment, Europe is doing enough to stop Ukraine losing, but not doing enough to help it win. And I think there are a lot of talk now about what else should be done to ramp up the pressure. President Putin's economy is struggling. They're not making the big advances on the front line. Ukraine is hitting the energy infrastructure very carefully. So what should the West be doing? And a no-fly zone has come back on the table again. And one of the reasons I think it stands more chance now is that Russia has put drones in NATO territory, in Poland, 19 of them. It's put them into Romania. It's also flown 3 Su-31 jets into Estonian airspace, not clipping the corner, but for 12 minutes. They were all premeditated acts. And what NATO did was worried about what it should do next. No-fly zone would be a legitimate way of the NATO turning around and saying, if Putin can't be trusted to not send weapons into NATO territory, we have to put a no-fly zone in place in order to protect our own territory. And I think, therefore, it's a greater justification for ramping up the pressure. And that's a step, I think, that would make a big difference.
You just mentioned about this incidents with drones, Russia's so-called hybrid attacks on Poland and Estonia. What was Vladimir Putin thinking about by ordering such provocation, such a hybrid attack against NATO countries?
So at face value, it doesn't make any sense at all. I remember at the time I did a couple of radio interviews and people said, he must be mad. And I said, okay, as a military guy, Russia has struggled in the fight against Ukraine. The last thing it wants to do is to get NATO involved. So why have they done that? I think from a military perspective, one of the reasons they've done it is because there was more and more talk of the European arm of NATO getting more involved with Ukraine, stepping up the level of support. What Putin has very effectively done by putting drones into Poland, drones into Romania, flying into Estonia's airspace, is given NATO another problem to wrestle with. And it distracts it from adding support to Ukraine and instead worrying about protecting itself. All of that suits Vladimir Putin's objectives.
Bloomberg reported that there was a meeting between European diplomats and Russian diplomats in Moscow, and European diplomats warned Kremlin that they would be ready to shut down enemy's aircraft in case of further provocations and violations of NATO's airspace. Why didn't NATO shut down Russia's aircraft? And don't you think that this would be the best ever deterrence?
Again, I, as a military and a former pilot, I completely agree. You look back in 2015, when 2 Russian fighters flew towards Turkish airspace. One turned away, the other one came into Turkish airspace, and an F-16 from Turkey shot the Russian fighter jet down. Now, Vladimir Putin exploded with anger. There was all sorts of measures and the sanctions that flowed from that. But the key message was Russia never, ever since then has put anything into Turkish airspace. One of the things as a military guy, you don't ever want to have to fight. What you want to do is demonstrate deterrence, that your enemy sees there's greater risk in provoking the bear than there is benefit in doing it. By Vladimir Putin poking out offences and we did nothing, he will now feel emboldened. There is no doubt in my mind that those fighter jets up in the north in Estonia, I've flown fighter jets, they have not got on their identification friend and foe. They were not talking to the Estonian airspace. They are in a modern fighter jet, they know exactly where they are, and therefore that was pre-planned as an operation. If you don't shoot them down, particularly when Russia has demonstrated its willingness to go to war, you do not send a strong message, and Russia has very successfully put NATO on the back foot. I understand the nervousness from some of our politicians. They say it's escalating if you shoot them down. I say it's not. Russia knows what the rules are. If it breaks the rules, you need to be very robust. Otherwise, we're in a boxing ring and we're holding our hands behind our back as Vladimir Putin starts to punch us. I don't think that's reasonable at all.
Meanwhile, Kremlin threatens a full-scale war against NATO if NATO decides to shut down Russia's aircraft. Don't you think that Kremlin just continues to bluff, to continues his bluffing strategy against NATO?
I agree entirely, and I refer back to as a military advisor, if I was advising Putin and looking at the invasion of Ukraine, your biggest strategic risk is if NATO decides to get involved, because NATO has an order of magnitude more capability than Russia does. Russia has struggled against Ukraine, which had older Soviet equipment, but has only prevailed because of the bravery, the courage, the sacrifice of your brave soldiers. Last thing Russia wants to do is to get NATO involved. So by threatening it, whether it's nuclear or whether it's if you get involved, but we've seen no evidence whatsoever that Russia would have any benefit in getting involved militarily. What you have to conclude is that Putin's approach so far has been effective at scaring NATO, has been effective at scaring European countries, and that's not healthy because Putin will continue to test NATO until we start standing up to him robustly.
How far we are to a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Do you feel that this is just discussions in Western capitals or a serious plan to also to help Ukraine to have upper hand during negotiations with the Russian side?
The no-fly zone, I think you and I have talked about that before. It sounds simple. The key to a no-fly zone is the rules of engagement, because if a Russian aircraft stays outside the no-fly zone, but uses its radar to light up a NATO aircraft in the no-fly zone and then fires a missile, what do you do? And also, if a surface-to-air missile system based in Russia fires a missile at a NATO, do you fire back? Because if you fire back at a missile system in Russia, you kill Russian soldiers on Russian territory. So there are lots of rules of engagement that need to be thought through before you put one in place. I don't think we're going to see a no-fly zone tomorrow, but what I do think is that for some time, NATO leaders were uncomfortable with the idea of a no-fly zone. Now that Putin has launched drones into NATO countries, if NATO believes that Putin cannot be trusted with his own weapons, then you now have the opportunity to justify why you have to impose a no-fly zone over part of the country just to protect NATO. And that is not a provocation, that's not an escalation, that's a perfectly reasonable way of protecting NATO territory.
And is NATO really ready for a war with Russia? Because during the attack on Poland, this air incursion, Polish airspace and NATO's Air Force used $2 million missiles to shut down such cheap drones. Do you feel that this sounds like a sustainable war strategy for a long-term war?
Well, I think you have to be careful here. We're making a jump. I think NATO didn't really expect Russia to launch an attack against NATO. And if it wanted to do a proper attack against NATO, it wouldn't be sending cheap drones across that are not going to do any real damage. It would have sent one of its hypersonic missiles, its Kinzhal missiles, or done a targeted strike. When they were doing reports of those drones, you could make the argument that they were a mistake. Russia is launching up to 1,000 drones a day at Ukraine, so it's less than, it's 1 to 2% of those that go wrong. When I was in the military and we were dropping weapons, up to 10% of them didn't work properly. So I think there was just possible that was a plausible reason why Putin had done that. As soon as you've got the jets on top of that as well, you go, no, this is very definitely a strategy by Putin, almost certainly just to cause NATO to worry about its own defense rather than attack.
there are many people also in Ukraine who are concerned about NATO's resolve to defend NATO's territory. If Russia deliberately attacks NATO, will NATO be ready to retaliate in proper way, or just to conduct another so-called Article 4 discussions in Brussels?
I think this is a very topical question. NATO was formed as a response to the end of the Second World War, the response to the threat from the Soviet Union. If you didn't have NATO today, would it be invented today? I don't know. Now, it is invested, but if, for example, Russia was to bomb Estonia, would America get involved and risk a nuclear war? Now, I honestly believe it would, because the whole purpose of deterrence is that we have this unique safety alliance that focused on defense, not against attack, and it was deliberately designed to stop countries like Russia, because we have benefits of experience of 2 world wars that start small and get much bigger. How do you make sure we have collective defense? That's our strength. The problem we have at the moment is obviously the United States, that spend more money in NATO than everybody else put together, has justifiably asked questions about why all the members of NATO are not all paying their way. As a result of that, a lot of countries are now increasing their defense spending. So at the moment, I'm confident that NATO is robust. I'm confident that NATO is strong. As to the weapons you use, I think nobody believes at the moment that Russia wants to put itself in a position to confront NATO. And I think NATO is going to therefore be ready for war, but not expecting it at the moment.
If Russia continues to attack, to conduct such so-called air incursion into NATO's airspace, what would NATO do from your perspective?
Well, there's been some very interesting conversations going on, because a lot of our political masters are nervous about shooting down Russian platforms. But the more they're told that this isn't an accident, this is a deliberate provocation, we're not talking about, with the drones, anybody being in there. You're not talking about the death of anybody. And even the fighter jets, nearly all the time, the pilots will eject out of the jets. So it's more, if you're choosing to confront NATO, you have to be prepared to take the consequences. And I think there is a growing understanding from our political masters that something else has to be done. I think the really interesting question, which is more profound, is what is Europe going to do in support of Ukraine? If we do nothing but what we've been doing, Ukraine will gradually lose. Putin will stop eventually for maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but then probably start again. If Ukraine was to fall, Europe will be threatened. And I think there's some really interesting conversations going on at the moment that say, is it enough to make Ukraine hold its place in the fight but lose slowly? Or what is it that we need to do to force President Putin to stop? The different question is, can you ever get rid of Russia out of Ukraine entirely? But that's a completely different question.
And President Trump is confident that Ukraine can retake all territories taken by the Russian side. Let's cover U.S. politics in the matter of support for Ukraine. Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. has begun to provide Ukraine with additional intelligence to help this conduct more strikes deep inside Russia to target Russia's energy grip. Don't you think that President Trump has understood that Ukraine is not losing the war, but still has some good cards?
I think President Trump is well aware that President Putin has a lot of cards, using his vernacular. What it means is that I think my own view, I keep clear of politics generally, is I think President Trump does want the war to stop. I think he does want the killing to stop. I think he thought that he could do a deal with President Putin, and I respect the fact that he seems to have had a go at doing that. the powerful message that came back was that President Putin is not interested at all with doing a deal. And therefore, the question is then, how does Trump stop the war? If you accept the premise that Putin will only stop if he's achieved his objectives, which looks like it's the Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson region plus Crimea, that might take 2 or 3 more years to do that. The only other reason he'll stop is if he's forced to stop. And he can be forced to stop because of economic means or because of military means. At the moment, I don't see any appetite for the West to put boots on the ground and be involved militarily. But economically, going back full circle, there is a lot more that the West could do to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. And I think that's where the West is trying to look at. And certainly President Trump, he does not want to walk away from this war. He does not want to be made a fool of out of this war. But I don't think one statement on his social media changes American policy.
You just mentioned about sanctions. According to Bloomberg, G7 countries are finalizing the deal to impose additional sanctions on Russia's wartime economy. From your perspective, would it be enough to force Putin to negotiating table? And if Trump imposes his high tariff sanctions, devastating sanctions, as he just describes this, would it be enough to convince Putin that it's high time to halt this war, to at least try to save your country?
I've never been a believer that sanctions will stop the war, but I do think they will make it earlier rather than later. So if it increases the pressure on President Putin, let's be clear, President Putin knows that the role of Russian dictators doesn't often last a long time. And when it ends very abruptly. Lots of the people that control Russia, the oligarchs and the like, they have seen they can't go on holiday in Paris. They can't go on holiday in London. Their yachts have been taken. Their children can't go to private schools around the world. And this was meant to be over in 3 days, if you remember. We're now 3.5 years in, and with no end in sight, and with the Russian economy getting worse. I think the pressures are building on President Putin, and the quicker that you ramp up those pressures, the more likely it is that President Putin decides to negotiate. I think one thing, though, is that would force a much quicker negotiation. Early in the war, the Ukraine managed to take back a lot of Kharkiv quickly. That shocked Russia. There was a spring offensive planned. That didn't do very much at all. But if Ukraine was able to seize the initiative and push Russia back somewhere, I think you'd probably see President Putin keen to get to the negotiating table, because he would not want to go through all this pain at home and then risk losing that territory. That might be the way to get Putin to the table.
But would he be able to, he would like to present any kind of victory for his population to justify this high cost for this war? Don't you think that he really doesn't have a way out of this war?
It's a great question, because a lot of the West is talking about how to give an off-ramp to President Putin. Bear in mind, right at the start, you said that Putin doesn't tell the truth to his population. He will be able to say whatever, however it ends, even if he only gets half the territory he has now, that will still be painted as a victory. He will turn around and say, Sevastopol, it's historically significant. That is now ours. We no longer just have the Kursk road bridge. We also have a land bridge to Russia. And therefore, he's secured the future of Crimea. He will paint that as a victory. Remember, one of the objectives was to make Russia great again. And all of a sudden, from being a small country, it is now on the global stage. And it's also got new friendships with China, India, loads of other countries. I think Putin will paint this as a victory. The West will see it as a humiliating failure. But that's not the way the Russian people will see it.
Let's also cover our final topic, this big meeting, newsworthy meeting between U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, U.S. President Donald Trump, and many senior U.S. officials, generals, admirals. Also, U.S. has renamed Department of Defense as a Department of War if you were US four-star general sitting in this meeting, what would you feel?
I think one of the things you have to remember is that most of the generals will have been in the military for 25 to 30 years. They have watched a lot of politicians come and go. Unlike all of the other crowds that President Trump addresses, and there are people whooping and cheering and hollering and calling his name, there was silence through his speech. He even joked about it. It's very quiet here. I normally get lots of applause. President Trump went through his list of achievements like, I've solved 7 wars. The military that study war know that's not true. And so the only sound in the hall was when they clicked their heels together when their commander-in-chief came onto the stage. That was very telling, that it doesn't matter what Trump does, he can't force the generals to applaud him. He can't force the generals to say what a great person he is. The generals are responsible for the military capability of the most powerful nation in the world, and they want to make sure that whatever political person comes in, that they preserve the core of that professionalism, that courage, that sacrifice, and that's what will be absolutely the focus of those generals' minds.
And what is your assessment of these statements made by Pete Hegseth about so-called warrior ethos and this new Trump's playbook, new strategy?
Yeah, I think we might read too much into that. I think society is wondering about what we do about representation, whether it's black, white, coloured, whether it's female, whether it's minority groups. And there does seem to have been a lot of an effort to be more diverse in employment. I think the military, whilst it is important that it does have diversity, it mustn't lose sight that its primary aim is to go to fight wars. The best example I can give is you have a fire brigade. I don't care who the fireman is. If my house is on fire and I'm upstairs, the fireman needs to get up that ladder, throw me over his shoulder and get me out. I don't care if it's male, female, gay, lesbian. I don't care, but they must be good at their job. And that is true in the military as well. And I think all that Pete Hegseth was doing was giving the military license to say, choose the best person for the job. You're not there to meet targets anymore. And I think that's probably a good thing.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. It was really an insightful conversation, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.